There was a creek to the southeast and a creek to the northwest, and the river down the middle. So if there was water anywhere in the country, we had it. And of course he had built good tanks. I saddled old Denver and started off east through the Dale pasture and rode down our east fence plumb to the southeast corner. Then I cut back across West Fork and rode west between it and the river, winding through the brush till I got nearly to the west side, and then turned north and rode up on the hill in the south pasture and rested a while. The whole south end of our land was brushy, mesquite and post oak mixed. The farther north you went, the more mesquite and the less post oak. Dad said when he first saw the country there wasn't a mesquite tree anywhere, or a prickly pear. Then I crossed the river and rode northwest till I hit Onion Creek, and turned and came back southeast again along the top of Idiot Ridge. There wasn't no mesquite on the ridge. It hadn't got that far north. The north end of our land was still prairie, but you could look south off the ridge and see the brush coming. Our headquarters sit southeast of the ridge, on a long hill. Finally, I rode back through the league pasture to the barn and turned old Denver loose. I sat on the lot fence a while, resting and thinking. It was about an hour before sundown, and I didn't much want to go up to the house since there wasn't nobody there. At least the milk pen calves were little company. For a day or two after Dad died, I had actually been in the mood to sell the place, just dump it and go where I wouldn't have to be reminded of Dad all the time, or of Molly. But I got over wanting to do that. For one thing, I got so I liked being reminded of Dad. Of course, I didn't like to think of Molly and Eddie, but it would have been pretty yellow-bellied to let them run me out of the country. Most of the time, I hadn't paid much attention to the country. Dad had done that. But what I saw that afternoon looked pretty good to me. I didn't think no more about moving, but even staying took a lot of thinking about. One thing for sure, I wasn't no solitary owl. I couldn't stay on the place by myself. In about a month, I would have been dead of lonesomeness. So I figured the best thing to do was marry Mabel. She was the best girl left in the county, and I figured I could get along with her okay. She would be so grateful to me just for marrying her that she shouldn't fuss none for about 15 years. Then if Johnny ever come back, I could hire him to help me run the place. I wanted to buy some new land if I could. I didn't intend to stop with what I'd inherited. That would have been pure laziness. Of course, Mabel and Johnny wasn't too fond of one another, but I figured that would iron out once me and her was married and he quit trying to get in her pants. I sat on the fence and never even noticed sundown. I happened to notice the moon's reflection in the milk lot water trough. The house looked so lonesome I just didn't go in. I caught old Denver and rode to Thalia without even eating supper. When I stepped up on the boarding house porch, I could see Mabel hadn't gone to bed. She was sitting in her chair patching a quilt. I felt sorry for her. When I knocked, she had to put on a bathrobe before she let me in. "Why, come in, Gid," she said. "I was just thinking about you." "You look kind of blue," she said. "Want some hot chocolate?" I said no. Her bedroom was neat as a pin. "I guess I am a little down in the dumps," I said. "You want to sit out on the porch a while? It's a real warm night." "Okay," she said. We got in the glider and rocked, and she snuggled up against me, warm as a hot water bottle. We seen the moon way up there, and I wondered if its reflection was still down at the ranch in the water trough. "Honey, let's get married," I said. "I'm sick of this living alone." "Why, I am too," she said, and she squeezed my hand right hard. I hugged her and kissed her and stood up thinking she'd go in and get her clothes on so we could wake up the JP and get it done and go on home. But boy, she fooled me. I never seen her run backwards so quick. "Why, I couldn't hold my head up if I got married that way," she said. "What are you thinking about?" She talked like it would take us 2 weeks just to get married. I never knew she was that silly about things before. She wouldn't even let me spend the night with her. I ended up having to pay 50 cents to spend the night in the damn hotel. But I didn't back out. There wasn't nothing to be gained from that, not that I knew of. Only I told her the next morning that I wasn't going to wait around no 2 weeks. I had too many other things to do. She said I'd have to at least ride back to the ranch and get my good clothes. I'd just come in like I was. So I done it. While I was gone, she quit her job and packed her suitcases, and when I got back to town, I hunted up a feller I knew and just bought me an automobile. I figured if Eddie White could afford one, I could too. He showed me how to drive it, and I got it to the rooming house and put Mabel's stuff in it. Then we walked over to the Methodist preacher's house. It was a pretty day, and Mabel was dolled up like $100. I had on a wool suit and was about to cook. Anyway, the preacher called his wife in to witness, and he married us. I gave him $3. Mabel hung on my arm all the way back to the rooming house, and I guess everybody in town knew what we'd done. I sure was hot and embarrassed, but Mabel didn't even want me to take my coat off till we got out of town. It took a lot of wrestling to get that damn car home. No better roads than they were. I wished 100 times I'd never bought it. But we finally made it, and I yanked the car stopped by the back gate. "Well, here we are," I said, "man and wife," and I started to get her stuff out of the rumble seat. "Kid, you ought to be ashamed. Ain't you going to help me down?" she said. "I see I'll have to do a little work on you." And she never wasted no time starting. Chapter 19. The first month we were married, I don't think we saw a living soul but one another. I guess I must have run into a few other people here and there, but I sure didn't say much to them, and I didn't give them the chance to say much to me. If there was one thing I didn't feel like putting up with, it was jokes about newlyweds. Just being one was joke enough. Of course, it really wasn't that Mabel was so bad herself. She was a good person, a real good person, I guess, and she damn sure wasn't lazy or anything like that. She did her work, and she looked after me a damn sight better than I had been looking after myself. And there was many a time when I was awful glad to have her around. Still, it never changed the facts, and the facts was that I had done an awful ignorant thing. When I first realized just how ignorant, I was flat embarrassed for myself. A 10-year-old kid could have showed as much judgment as I showed. I guess Dad had been right when he said I didn't know anything about taking care of myself. Mabel was a big surprise to me, of course. I thought I knew her to a T before I ever went in to marry her. I hadn't been married to her 2 weeks before I knew that a blind idiot could have found out more about her than I managed to. For one thing, she was a lot prouder of herself than I thought she was, and for another, a lot less proud of me. I soon found out that she didn't consider me no particular prize, but I had better be sure and let her know that I considered her one. She seen herself as the belle of the county. Nobody was going to talk her out of that view. I soon gave up trying. She could see herself any way she wanted to. It come down to two things. The first was that Mabel just wasn't a very generous person. I guess she never had anything to learn to be generous with. For every nickel's worth of hers she put out, she wanted $1's worth of me, and got it, too. The second thing was that I was still crazy about Molly. What few little times I'd been with her meant more to me than a lifetime with Mabel could have. I had feeling for Molly and didn't for Mabel, and Mabel had none for me. It wasn't very long before I was hanging around the lots till dark for a plumb different reason. It used to be I didn't want to go to the house because nobody was there. Pretty soon I was working late because I didn't know what to do at the house when I got there. I seen the moon in the water trough many a time, and I seen it in the sky, and if one thing was for sure, it was that the moon didn't care. What I did didn't make no difference to it or to nothing or to nobody, I felt like. I did get a card from Johnny, but I didn't have the guts to answer it. I never was bluer than I was that first month. If a feller has to be lonesome, he's better off being lonesome alone. But I'd kicked that advantage away forever, and there was no use sulking about it. It was done, and that was final. I would just have to make the best of it, only it didn't look like a very good best. It reminded me of something old man Grinsom had said one time. It was the day we first run into him in Clarendon. Just to make conversation, I asked him how long he had been in the Panhandle. "Since '93, he said. "I come here with nothing but a fiddle and a hard-on. I've still got the fiddle." And when we seen them 7 boys, we knew where the other went. My case was a little different. I got married with a ranch and the other, and I still had them both. And to be right honest, I guess it served me right. Chapter 20. It was late April when we married, and May was the month we stayed by ourselves. By June, I knew I had to do a little better than that for myself some way. I was getting where I didn't even enjoy my work. One morning, I had to fix a little fence on the northwest side, and when I got that done, I decided it was time I went and checked up on my neighbors. The closest one was Molly. When I rode past her barn, I didn't see no automobile, and that was a great relief. It took so much nerve to get me there, I would have hated to have to ride away again. But Molly, she was there, out in the backyard, hanging the washing on the line. There was a good breeze, and the sheets were flapping, so she didn't notice me riding up. She looked like the same old Molly, only more so, wearing Levi's and an old cotton shirt with the shirt tail out. She had a clothespin in her mouth and 3 or 4 more in the shirt pocket. Her shirt tail was damp in front where the sheets had flopped against her, and her hair was loose, hanging down her back and getting in her face now and then. I seen her brush it out of the way with one hand. I thought she just looked lovely. I got off and tied old Willie to a mesquite tree. Then I walked into the yard and stopped behind her at the windmill. I didn't know if I could talk. "Hello, neighbor," I said. "How are you getting along?" She turned around with a tablecloth in her hands. I thought she was going to cry. She had those little dark places under her eyes. She dropped the wet tablecloth in the grass, and I went over to pick it up. "My, Gid," she said, "you scared me." For some reason, I was real embarrassed. I squatted down and picked up the wet tablecloth and was going to try and wipe the grass off it, but Molly squatted down too and put one of her wet hands on my neck, and then there was her face, and she kissed me. I shivered clear through, but her face against mine was as warm as sunshine, and I had to sit down in the grass and hug her. "Now ain't this some way for old married folks to be acting?" I said. She grinned, but it was just half a grin, really, and her mouth quivered. "It's nice, though," she said. "I'm so glad to see you. Let's go in the house." I helped her up and put my arm around her. We let the tablecloth and the clothespins lie where they fell. I asked her if she wanted to finish hanging out the washing, and she shook her head. "No, but let's sit on the cellar a while," she said. "It's too pretty to go in. I just don't like to sit on the dewy grass." The cellar was stone, and the sun had warmed it up. She held one of my hands. "Where's Eddie?" I said. "Just relax," she said. She knew what I was thinking. "He's gone to Oklahoma, working in the oil fields." "Good Lord," I said. "He's a strange feller. I don't see how he can stand to go off and leave somebody like you." She snickered. "That's because you ain't Eddie. He ain't the married kind. He'd go crazy if he couldn't get off and run around." I wanted to ask her why in the hell she married him then, but I bit my tongue and didn't. Molly was in the sweetest, happiest mood. She kept glancing at me and smiling as she rubbed my hand between hers. "Well, I'm just so glad to see you," she said, and in a minute turned around and kissed me. I held on to her for a long time, and then I figured I better tell her something for her own good. Only she knew what was on my mind again. "Don't be so scared," she said. "That's no way to make me happy. It's just us here, you know." "I know," I said, "and you're the sweetest woman I ever had hold of. I don't mind saying that. But now listen, we got to get something straight. I'm married and you're married, and I ain't the shy old kid I used to be." "Good," she said, grinning. "What's shy got to do with it?" She reached up and pulled a thread off my shirt collar and rubbed my neck with her hand. "It's got a lot," I said. "This kissing and hugging is just inviting it. The state I'm in, it's whole hog or nothing." "That's so nice," she said. "One thing I've always hoped is that you'd come over here someday ready to be whole hog in love with me. I hoped sooner or later you would." Well, that just flabbergasted me. "Honey, good Lord," I said. "I've been whole hog in love with you for the last 10 years, maybe more. Surely you know that." She looked me in the eye for a long time, a little sad, with one corner of her mouth turned up just a little. "I know you think so," she said, "but you haven't, kid. You ain't even this morning yet." "Well, what do you mean, whole hog?" I said. It seemed to me, looking at her with her face so close to mine, that it was impossible to love a person more than I loved her, and the way she sent that cool look up at me made me mad. I could have hated her. It was a bad feeling. I felt myself getting mad, and I didn't want to. "I mean just you loving me," she said, "and nothing else. Just pure me and pure you. But you're always thinking about Johnny or Eddie or your ranch or your dad or what people will think or what's right and what's wrong, something like that. Or else you're thinking about yourself and how much you like me. Or else you just want to get me in bed. Or else you just like to think about having me for a girl. That ain't loving nobody much. I can tell that." "Why, goddamn you," I said. "That's some way for you to talk." I was thinking about her marrying Eddie. "That's the way I've always talked to you, darling," she said. "You ain't thinking about me, you're thinking about Eddie." She reached up her hand to my cheek and smiled, but I was too mad then to care. It was like my blood vessels had busted. I yanked her back across the cellar. I seen later where it skinned her leg, and held her down and kissed her. It's a wonder she didn't get fever blisters. And for a long time we stayed that way, and she kissed back, only I knew it wasn't working somehow. It wasn't convincing her of anything. I let up and looked at her. She felt warm, but she still looked cool, and there was a terrible strain inside me. I didn't know what to do or how. "Molly, what do I have to do?" I said. "You drive me half crazy, don't you know that?" "I wish I could drive you all the way," she said, holding my hand against her chest. I could feel her breathing. "I didn't know you were like that," I said. "Why do you want to hurt me that way?" "Oh, Gid," she said, and tears come in her eyes. "I don't want to hurt you. I just want you to turn loose of yourself for a minute so you can hold me. That's the only thing I want." She got upset then and cried, and I was ashamed of myself for getting mad. At the same time, I was still mad. I didn't see how she could go marry Eddie and then expect much of me. But I didn't want her sad. "I just don't guess I know how to do that," I said. "If I did, I would." She sat up and wiped away the tears and smiled at me, her cheeks still wet. "I know you don't," she said, "but maybe I can show you." She took me in the house then, and it was nice and cool and shady after the sunshine. I made her let me put some iodine on the big skinned place on her leg. It burned like the devil. I felt silly to have done a rough thing like that, but Molly never mentioned it. I was all nervous and tense and jumpy and nearly sick, and she kind of loved it all out of me, like a fever. I was so upset that for a long time after we had done it, I couldn't go to sleep or be still in the bed. But she stayed with me. I remember her face, and I finally did sleep and slept good. When I woke up, the afternoon sun was pouring in the windows, and the room was hot. Molly was still with me and was holding my hand against her chest. She had thrown all the covers back. "You're a good sleeper once you get to sleep," she said. "You slept 4 hours without even turning over." I pulled her down so my face was right against hers. "I'm not going to let you go," I said. "I'm going to give you everything I've got to give. You're the only person that's worth it. I don't know why you wanted to take up with somebody worthless like me again, but it's too late for you now." She swung her head back to get her hair out of her eyes, and it fell all over my face. I lay for an hour, I guess, smelling her and listening to her breathe. I could tell she was pleased about something. She was a mystery to me, but I was glad I had finally pleased her some way. After a while the sun moved, and the sunlight came right on the bed, so we were laying in a shaft of it with a million little dust motes in the air above us. Things looked lovely and funny for a change. "I swear you smell like a gourd, Molly," I said. "I never noticed that before." "Maybe I never smelled that way before," she said. "I'm starving. You stay here and let me get us something to eat." I was pretty hungry, too, only not hungry enough to get up. I never felt so good and lazy in my life. Maybe I would just stay there in Molly's bed for a month or two. That would have set people on their ears. Molly crawled out and wound up her hair, standing by the bed with the sunlight across her stomach. "You're a shapely hussy," I said. She snickered and pulled on her Levi's. I must have dozed off again for a little while. When I opened my eyes, she was sitting on the bed cross-legged, with just her Levi's on, eating a piece of cornbread and drinking buttermilk. There was some for me, with a couple of pieces of cold chicken sitting on a chair by the bed. It wasn't there long. When we finished, there were cornbread crumbs all over the bed, and Molly had buttermilk on her upper lip. I wiped it off with a corner of the sheet. I wanted her to lay down again, but there were so many cornbread crumbs in the bed that it wouldn't do. So we both got up, and I put on my pants, and we went in the living room and sat on the couch and hugged and talked a while. "When I come over here today, I was going to ask you a lot of questions," I said, "like why you married him and all that. But I've just about forgot the questions, and I don't guess I really care about the ones I remember. What do you reckon caused that?" "Me, I guess," she said. She was eating a piece of stick candy she had found somewhere, and was slouched back against my arm without nothing on but her pants, just as relaxed as she could be, and in a perfect humor. She wouldn't let me have any of the candy, but when I kissed her now and then, I got her taste in the candies, too. "One thing I do want to settle, Molly. What do you want to do about these people we're married to? Do you want us to go off somewhere or anything like that?" "Do you want to go?" she said. "No," I said. "That's kind of against my style." "I'm glad," she said, "because I wouldn't go. Right here in this house is where I always want to live." We got a quilt and stretched out together on the living room floor and stayed there till plumb dark. I just couldn't quite get my mind made up to go home, and she didn't hurry me. "Gid, "I'm ready to have a baby now," she said. "I'm convinced you'll make a good daddy." "Good Lord," I said, sitting up. It was all shadowy in the room. She rested her head against my chest. We sure didn't get very far from one another that day. I guess she had been as lonesome as me. "You're a strange woman," I said. "How come you don't want your husband for its daddy?" "Oh, Gid," she said, "he wouldn't make no good daddy, not as good a one as you." "You don't really care, do you?" she said, looking up at me. I could barely see her eyes, but her voice was real serious. "I mean, if me and you had a baby, of course I'll let on it's Eddie's. Just you and me and the baby will know." I thought about it a long time. Here I was, married to Mabel, and her to Eddie. It was strange to think of a baby coming out of Molly. But I knew one thing. If one did, I wanted it to be mine. "No, I don't care, sweetheart. I'd like for you to, if you want to." She curled around me. "I knew you'd come to me sometime," she said. And that was all we said that day. After a while, I got up and dressed to go, and she walked out to my horse with me. We stood there a while, looking at the Milky Way and the Big Dipper and all the rest of the summer stars. Finally, I got on. "I'll just get over when I can," I said. "Okay? I probably can't stay this long every time. I sure miss you." "Okay," she said. "Me too." I rode on home by moonlight. It was bright enough I seen a big old coyote loping into the brush ahead of me. I should have been thinking about a story for Mabel, I guess, but I was thinking about Molly instead, and what a tender sort of person she was. And yet she had something fierce in her, like Dad had in him. I saw her again, all the ways she'd looked that day, hanging up clothes in the morning with her shirt tail out, and sitting on the couch that evening without no shirt tail at all. She had the most changing kind of face, for it always to be the same one. Riding across the league, I run into Dad's old horse, and he nickered. I sure did miss Dad. Chapter 21. It was just amazing how seeing Molly every once in a while improved things for me. I began to kind of take an interest in life again, and I never seen a whole lot of her either. I hardly ever got over more than once a week. Lots of times I was too busy, and other times when I did ride over, I'd see Eddie's car and have to come back. There wasn't no sense aggravating him. But it didn't bother me too much if I missed seeing her one occasion or another. I knew that if I was a little patient, there would be a time when we could get together. Those times were worth the wait. Molly was awful good to me. And good for me, too. In the meantime, between visits to her, I had the ranch to run and Mabel to live with, and I began to see that I had better get busy and try to do a little better job of both than I had been doing. It wasn't fair to Dad and Mabel not to. At first I was pretty worried that Mabel would find out I was courting somebody else, but that was just because I still didn't know Mabel too well. In those days she was so proud of herself I couldn't have convinced her I was in love with somebody else if I'd come right out and told her, which I didn't. I was fond of Mabel and a little sad for her, but not as torn up about marrying her as I had been. And I made her a pretty decent husband, too. I got to understanding her a lot better as time went on. We never was much of a delight to one another, I had to admit that, but I know I treated her better after I took up with Molly. Mabel was just a combination of proud and scared. She never had anything, and she always thought she was entitled to everything. It made me blue that I couldn't be more wholehearted with her, but I just couldn't. She wasn't the one. But anyway, she kept such a close eye on herself all the time that she hardly noticed me. She didn't have much notion of what was going on with me, and a good thing she didn't. After I got over my first blueness and began to treat her about half nice, she thought I was plumb crazy about her. "Well, I see you're beginning to learn how to treat a lady," she said one night. It was after supper, and we were sitting on the porch. I had complimented her on her cobbler or something like that. "I guess I ain't had much practice," I said. "Well, you can get a lot on me," she said, "and don't think I won't tell you when you make a mistake. I ain't bashful about that." She scooted a little closer to me on the step. I put my arm around her and hugged her and never said a word. It was dark, and we could hear an old hoot owl hooting somewhere in the pastures to the east. There wasn't no moon that night, but there was a good breeze from the southeast, and the country smelled good. We done had lilac in the yard. Life always seemed so complicated in the evenings. Mabel seemed perfectly happy, and I was sitting with my arm around her, about 2/3 melancholy. "Let's go in, honey," I said, "before the mosquitoes get to biting." "Well, you've got to kiss me first," she said. I did, and then we went inside and lit the lamps. Chapter 22. Early in June, I spent a hell of a day. Mabel woke up in a bossy mood and practically chased me out of the house, so I done the chores and doctored a few sicklings, and then decided I'd go to Antelope. That was where we got our mail then, and I thought while I was there I'd hire somebody to come up and thrash my wheat. We had a pretty fair wheat crop, and I was ready to get it thrashed. It was the last farm produce I ever intended to raise. I rode old Dirt Dauber that day, and I guess that was a mistake. He was the oldest horse on the place, and I never rode him nowhere except to get the mail. I think he was 23 years old. When I got to Antelope, I tied him up and gave him a good rest, while I talked with the boys a little. I found an old boy with a thresher, said he'd be up after my wheat the next day. While I was fiddling around, it come up a real mean-looking cloud in the northwest, and I figured then I'd do good to get home without getting wet. Besides which, the Montgomery Ward catalog had come that day, and it was so much extra weight I didn't know if old Dirt would be able to carry it. He was particular about weight. But I stuck the catalog in my saddle pouch, and we headed out. If it rained like it looked like it aimed to, that old boy wouldn't have to bother about my wheat. But I was wrong about the rain. It never rained 5 drops. What it did was hail, and I mean hailed. It started out the size of plums and moved up to pullet eggs, and before it was done there was hailstones on the ground bigger than anything our old turkeys ever hatched. Of course, me and Dirt were right out in the open when it started, and getting him to run was out of the question. I tried holding the catalog over my head and dropped it in about 2 minutes. Finally, we got to a little old half-grown post oak, and I figured that was the best protection we would find. I unsaddled right quick and crawled under Dirt, and then under the saddle, too, and scrunched down tight. The first thing Dirt did was to try to piss on me, but I wasn't worried about that. I was worried about my skull. I jobbed him a time or two to cut him off, and damned if the old son of a bitch didn't jerk loose and step right on my hip and run off. So far as I was concerned, it could hail him to death. I wasn't going after him. I got on the downwind side of the tree and hid as much of me as I could under the saddle and stayed put. At least none of the big ones hit my head. My saddle got dents in it that never did come out. It hailed for a solid hour. Finally, I didn't have to worry so much. I reached out and raked me up a kind of igloo and was pretty cozy. I had one less worry anyway, and that was the damn wheat crop. When it quit, the country looked like it was under a snowstorm. The sun came out in a little while and started melting it off, but some of the big piles didn't melt for 2 or 3 days. I was in a hell of a shape. Dirt had about halfway squashed my hip. I could hobble along, but carrying the saddle and blanket I couldn't make no time, particularly over that slippery hail. I guess Dirt had weathered it all right. I seen him about half a mile away, poking along toward home. "You old bastard," I said, "wait till I catch you." But all I could do was hobble on over to the Eldenfelders. They was a Dutch family that lived about half a mile away. I hated to run the risk of getting dog bit. They had about 50 damn mean turd hounds, but it was the only place in hobbling distance. However, it turned out all right. They fed me a little rotten cow meat and sent their big old dumb girl Annie to haul me home. A lot of the boys thought it was smart to get in Annie's pants because she was willing and about a half idiot, but I never fooled with her. She seemed kind of pathetic to me. The creek was up, so that was as far as she got me, but I gave her $1. "Bye-bye," she said. It's a wonder she could drive the wagon. I waded the creek and went on home. My hip was beginning to unsquash a little by then. Old Dirt was in the barn when I got there, trying to kick in the door to the oat bin. The old fart had so many knots on him, I didn't have the heart not to feed him. But when I got to the house, I wished I was back outside in a hailstorm. The 10 or 15 broken window lights hadn't improved Mabel's humor. I was thinking I might get a good hip rub, but I could have staggered in on 2 wooden legs and she wouldn't have cared. I didn't see no signs of supper, and I guess I said the wrong thing. "Hello," I said. "What's for supper, hail soup?" "I'll hail soup you," she said, "going off and leaving me in a storm like that. Where you been all afternoon?" "Well, I been coming home," I said. "It wasn't a very quick trip, I'll admit." "I bet you was," she said. "I bet you was sitting down in the Antelope Domino Hall, losing some of your inherited money." I let that pass. "Where's the mail?" she said. "Wasn't none but the catalog, and I lost that in the hail. I guess we'll have to get them to send us another one." She got so mad it tickled me. "What kind of a husband are you?" she said. "We'll do no such thing. You just saddle up and trot back and find it. I want to do some ordering out of that catalog before it gets too old." "Why, you're crazy," I said. "Hell, it's beat to pieces by now anyway. I imagine we can borrow one." "We ain't going to borrow nothing," she said. "You go get it. You lost it." I tried to grab her and hug her, hoping it would get her in a better humor, but she just stomped out to the bedroom, and I let her go. I got the milk bucket and milked, and when I got back, no sign of her. I cooked myself some bacon and eggs and ate supper. Then I washed the dishes, and still no Mabel. I went in the living room and did some figuring in my little day book. I was thinking of buying 3 sections of land that joined us on the northwest. About 9 o'clock I heard her, and she came in her bathrobe and nightgown, looking like she'd had a good nap. She was a shapely woman, too, when you caught her looking just right. "Hi," I said, and she sat down on my lap and kissed me and seemed fairly friendly. "Where's the catalog?" she said. "Good Lord," I said, "ain't you forgot that yet? It's right where I dropped it, and that's where it's going to stay as far as I'm concerned." "Well, I knew you was ignorant, but I never thought you was lazy," she said, and she jumped off my lap and went out the back door just boo-hooing. I would have swore she was crazy. But I went out to get her. I didn't want her to run around barefooted and get on a snake. That would really aggravate her. When I came out on the back steps, she ran down in the storm cellar. It was pitch dark down there, and I went over and stood on the steps. "Now, Mabel, come on out of there," I said. "There's no use in you taking on so over a damn catalog. You'll get a stinging lizard down there if you ain't careful." "I hope I do," she said. "I hope they sting me to death so I won't have to live with you." I started down, and damned if she didn't grab a jar of peach pickles off the shelf and threw it. I heard it hit the steps below me and break. Then she threw 2 more, just whatever she happened to grab. I thought, what the hell? There wasn't no use in provoking her to ruin all the preserves. "Okay," I said, "sleep down there if that's how silly you are." She didn't say nothing, so I went in and went to bed. There was a cot in the cellar, and it was a warm night. I didn't figure it would do her any harm, only I couldn't sleep worth a flip. I went back out twice more to try and persuade her, and all it did was cost me preserves. The last time I went was about 3:30, and I just sat down in the kitchen and read the almanac till it got light. Then I went down in the cellar, and she was curled up on the cot asleep, peaceable as a baby. But the cellar steps looked like a cyclone had hit a jelly factory. I went in to cook breakfast, and I heard her hollering at me, so I went out. "No, I ain't gone after the catalog yet," I said. "Could you carry me up these steps?" she said. "I'm barefooted, and I'm afraid I'll cut my foot on all this broken glass." "No, I'm afraid to carry you. I might drop you and break your precious butt." I went and got a basket and a broom and the ashes shovel and cleaned up the mess while she sat on the cot and watched. Then she came in and made coffee and never said another word about it, and for a day or 2 she was sweet as pie. Chapter 23. One morning early in July, a damn horse kicked a hole in the water trough, and while I was down patching it, getting wet up to my ears, I looked up and seen a horseback rider loping across the ridge toward the barn. By God, if it wasn't Johnny. He'd come home, and he was riding the prettiest little sorrel gelding you ever saw. He called him Jack of Diamonds. "Well, by God," I said, standing up to shake his hand, "where'd you get that horse?" "Bought him off a feller," he said. "How you been?" "Oh, fair," I said. "How long you been home?" "Since last night." "You're walking just like a normal feller. You don't look crippled." "I finally growed back together," he said. "This country sure looks good to me." "Well, we had 4 inches of rain in May. Of course, we had that hail. Heard about that. See it smashed hell out of your wheat." "What I get for raising it," I said. "Tie up your horse and stay a while. I got to patch this water trough." "I'll help you," he said, and he did. If he hadn't, I wouldn't have got the damn thing patched by dinner time. While we worked, he told me a million funny stories. He was the same old Johnny. I was sure glad to see him back. That night, of all things, me and him and Molly went coon hunting and had a hilarious time. Johnny's dad had a new coon dog he was proud of, and Johnny wanted some excitement, so he asked me if I wanted to go with him to try the dog out. I said sure, and after supper I told Mabel where I was going and met Johnny on the ridge. We decided to go over and see if Eddie was home, and if he wasn't, to take Molly. She was there by herself, peeling potatoes in the kitchen, and she put on an old pair of boots and was ready in a minute. Johnny had brought the dog with him across his saddle, and we all struck off toward the creek walking. It was a hot night with plenty of moon, but we took a lantern anyway. "I hope we don't get snake bit," Molly said. She had been bit once and was afraid of snakes. Sure enough, we killed 3 rattlers that night, but we didn't have any close calls. We hadn't been out 30 minutes when the dog treed a big old fat coon in a live oak tree. I didn't much want to kill him, because we'd have to lug him around all night, but we went ahead and done it. After that we got pretty excited, and the dog soon struck another trail. Johnny had the lantern and the gun, and I had the coon in one hand and Molly's hand in the other, so I could help her through the brush. "I like this," she said. "I'm glad y'all came by." Then the dog treed in the shaft of an old hollow oak, and from the squealing we heard it was a mama coon and 2 or 3 little ones. We never brought an axe, but the old tree was just barely standing, and me and Johnny pushed it over. Only no coons come running out. "Now what?" Molly said. "I'll stomp it open, I guess," Johnny said. About the time he said it, the mama coon went scooting out the open end of the tree, right between Molly's legs. She jumped about 3 feet. I had the gun and couldn't shoot for Molly, so it was up to the dog, and he let the old mama get plumb away. He was a good dog for treeing, but he wasn't worth a shit for fighting. She got in the creek, and he didn't have the backbone to go in after her. "Don't you all kill the little ones," Molly said. "I want one for a pet." "Sure," Johnny said. We blocked up the open end, and then Johnny stomped a hole in the old rotten wood. One little coon jumped right out into the dog's mouth, and that was all for him. I got down on my hands and knees and managed to grab another one by the neck and drag him out. He was nearly half grown, though, and I sure needed something to tie him with. Baling wire was what I needed, but that's the way. When you need baling wire, you can't find it, and when you don't need it, you're tangled up in it. "Do you think you can gentle him?" I said, holding him out so Molly could see. "Probably not," Molly said. Then Johnny yelled. He had kept his foot in the stomp hole, so the other little coon couldn't run out, only he discovered that his foot was stuck. I wasn't very worried. "Pull your boot off," I said, "or sit down or something." "Hell no," he said. "If I was to sit down wrong, I'd break this hip again and be laid up in the hospital another 3 months. My heel's stuck. See if you can stomp more hole." Molly and me thought it was funny. We stood there and laughed, only I didn't laugh long. The little coon that was in the log decided it was time to come out, and he did, right up Johnny's leg. Johnny yanked backward and fell a-spraddling. The coon went right over him and off, and the dog never seen it. I got so tickled, I forgot I was holding anything, and the little coon I had whipped around and bit clear through the palm of my hand. When he turned me loose, I was glad to do the same for him. I howled like a banshee. So Molly didn't get no pet, and we went home with just 1½ coons and a cowardly dog. But we had fun anyhow. When we got to Molly's, she bandaged my hand, and we sat up in the kitchen, eating all the stray food and talking over old times. We were all in high spirits, and Johnny told us a lot of stories about life on the plains. Finally, me and him slept a while on her living room floor, and about sunup she came in her nightgown and bathrobe and woke us up and cooked the best breakfast I ever ate. We did her chores for her, and about 6 o'clock rode off toward home, with Molly standing by the yard gate with a milk bucket in one hand watching us go. There was a big dew that morning, and the country looked as green and sparkly as it ever had in July. We stopped our horses on the ridge and talked about the grass and the cattle for a while. "Well, are you home to stay?" I said. "Did you quit your job?" "Yep, I'm here for good," he said. "You need a hand?" "Boy, you bet," I said. "If you want a job, you can start today and live in our bunkhouse, and we'll board you if you want to." "Fine with me if it's okay with Mabel," he said. I said it was. We hadn't said 2 words about her. "Of course, you might be ready to go in business for yourself," I said. "I wouldn't want to stand in your way if you do." "I am in business," he said. "The cowboy in business. You can have the ranching business. I don't want no part of it." "Okay," I said. "I'll go home and tell my old man and get my stuff," he said. "See you after a while." and him and old Jack of Diamonds went off along the ridge west in a long, easy lope, neither one of them carrying a care in the world. I just about envied Johnny, but I didn't quite. He was the most carefree, but I thought I had a few more good things than he had. I meant to swap him out of his horse, though. The sun was drying up the dew, so I got rid of Molly's bandage and went on home and ate another breakfast. Chapter 24. Johnny sure made a good hand. Me and him got things done in a day that I would have fiddled around with a week if I had been by myself. Besides, he was enjoyable to work with, at least most times. Sometimes he was the most aggravating feller I knew. Every once in a while he acted like he still intended to try and court Molly some, but I didn't figure he'd get very far with that. Having him to do the cow work left me more time to get ambitious, and the land bug began to bite me pretty bad. I had already decided that land was something I'd never have enough of, so one day I buckled on my spurs and rode to Wichita to the bank and borrowed enough money to buy them 3 sections that joined me on the northwest. They were a good place to start extending. I had a deed drawn up and took it with me for the other feller to sign and started home. I rode hard that afternoon. The automobile was broke down or I would have gone in it. The weather was terrible. It was late August, and I didn't need no thermometer to tell me it was over 100 degrees. When I crossed the Taylor place, I decided to take the deed up and show it to Molly. I was proud of that deed, and I already knew Eddie wasn't there. I had looked that morning. Molly was, though, every inch of her, and she couldn't have looked better to me if she'd been Lily Langtree. I knocked at the back door and went on in, and she was just turning away from the stove. She'd been putting up the last of her garden stuff. "You're about as hot as I am," I said. "I'm glad you come," she said. "Let's sit down and cool off." I drank a couple of dippers of water out of the water bucket. She sat down at the table and I offered her a dipperful. "I believe I will," she said, and she took the dipper and tilted her head back and drank.